46 years ago, Sister Margaret O'Connor stepped out of St. Catherine's Convent for her evening prayer walk and vanished without a trace. The 62-year-old nun, beloved by her community and known for her unwavering devotion, had followed the same forest path for over 2 decades. That September evening in 1979 would be the last time anyone saw her alive, plunging the quiet religious community of Millbrook into a darkness that would haunt them for decades. Before we continue, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps our channel bring you more stories like this one. Sister Margaret had been a pillar of St. Catherine's Convent since 1955. Her fellow sisters described her as methodical, gentle, and deeply spiritual. Every evening at exactly 5:30 p.m., she would walk the wooded trail behind the convent grounds, carrying her worn leather prayer book and her grandmother's rosary, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of devout Irish Catholics. On September 15, 1979, Sister Margaret followed her routine as always. Mother Superior Catherine Walsh watched from the kitchen window as the elderly nun disappeared into the tree line, her grey habit barely visible against the autumn foliage. When Margaret failed to return for evening prayers at 7 p.m., concern rippled through the convent walls. The initial search began at dusk. Sister Agnes and Sister Mary Rose retraced Margaret's usual path with flashlights, calling her name into the gathering darkness. The trail wound through dense Connecticut woodland for nearly 2 miles before connecting to an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. They found nothing. No sign of struggle, no dropped belongings, no indication of what might have happened. Local authorities were contacted at 10 p.m. Sheriff Robert Hayes arrived with 2 deputies and organized a more extensive search. They combed the forest until dawn, bringing in tracking dogs and volunteers from the nearby town. The dogs followed Margaret's scent along the familiar path, but lost it completely near a rocky outcropping about a mile from the convent. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation revealed troubling gaps. The logging road connected to State Route 9, a quiet highway that could have provided an escape route for anyone wanting to leave the area quickly. However, no witnesses reported seeing anything unusual that evening. The few cars that passed the road junction saw nothing suspicious. Detective Frank Morrison, assigned to the case, explored every possibility. Had Sister Margaret suffered a medical emergency and collapsed somewhere off the trail? Had she encountered a dangerous animal? The Connecticut woods were home to black bears, though attacks on humans were extremely rare. Could she have fallen into one of the old stone wells that dotted the abandoned farmland? More disturbing theories emerged as days turned to weeks. Sister Margaret was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 110 pounds. Could someone have abducted her? The thought sent shockwaves through the religious community. Nuns were supposed to be safe, protected by their sacred calling and the respect of society. The convent became a fortress of grief. Mother Superior Walsh struggled to maintain normalcy, while fielding constant questions from police and reporters. The other sisters moved through their daily prayers and duties like ghosts, jumping at every sound, afraid to walk the grounds alone. The evening prayer walks that had been a cherished tradition for decades were suspended indefinitely. Margaret's family was devastated. Her younger brother Thomas flew in from Boston, his face drawn with anguish as he spoke to investigators. "Maggie chose this life because she believed in goodness," he told Detective Morrison. "She trusted everyone. Maybe that trust was her downfall." The O'Connor family had always been proud of Margaret's calling. She was the middle child of 7, raised in a deeply Catholic household where serving God was considered the highest honor. Her decision to become a nun at age 19 had been celebrated, not mourned. Now Thomas found himself questioning everything his sister had believed in. As autumn turned to winter, the case grew cold. Search teams had covered hundreds of acres. Interviews with locals yielded nothing useful. The state police brought in additional resources, but the trail had gone completely cold. Detective Morrison worked the case obsessively, following up on every reported sighting, every anonymous tip, every theory, no matter how far-fetched. The media attention was intense but brief. For a few weeks, Sister Margaret's disappearance made headlines across New England. Religious communities everywhere offered prayers and support. But as new crimes and tragedies captured public attention, Margaret's story faded from the newspapers. The convent received fewer phone calls. The search volunteers stopped showing up. By Christmas 1979, the case had been unofficially set aside. Detective Morrison kept the file open, but without new evidence there was little more to investigate. The official theory was that Sister Margaret had suffered some kind of accident in the woods, perhaps a fall or medical emergency, and her body simply hadn't been found in the vast wilderness. But the O'Connor family refused to accept that explanation. Thomas hired a private investigator and organized his own search parties. He plastered missing person flyers throughout Connecticut and neighboring states. He believed with unshakable faith that his sister was still alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held against her will. The convent tried to heal. Mother Superior Walsh led special memorial services, though they couldn't hold a proper funeral without a body. Sister Margaret's cell was left exactly as she had kept it, spare and neat, with her Bible open to Psalm 23. Her prayer book remained on the nightstand, bookmarked at the evening devotions she would never complete. 9 years of silence followed Sister Margaret's disappearance, each passing season deepening the mystery that had consumed the small community of Millbrook. The case that had once commanded headlines and search parties had become nothing more than a dusty file in Detective Morrison's cabinet, a cold reminder of justice deferred and questions left unanswered. St. Catherine's Convent had never fully recovered from that September evening in 1979. The remaining sisters, now fewer in number due to natural attrition and transfers, moved through their daily routines with a persistent shadow of unease. The evening prayer walks had never resumed. The forest path that Sister Margaret had walked for 24 years remained untouched, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Mother Superior Catherine Walsh, now in her 70s, carried the weight of that night like a stone in her chest. She had been the last person to see Margaret alive, watching from the kitchen window as her sister in faith disappeared into the tree line. The image haunted her dreams. Margaret's grey habit catching the last rays of sunlight, her familiar silhouette growing smaller until the forest swallowed her completely. The younger sisters who had arrived at St. Catherine's after 1979 knew Margaret only through stories and the empty chair that remained at the dining table. Sister Agnes, now in her 60s, had become the unofficial keeper of Margaret's memory. She maintained Margaret's cell as a sort of shrine, dusting the simple wooden furniture and keeping fresh flowers by the window. The prayer book still lay open to Psalm 23, its pages yellowed with age. In town, the disappearance had become local folklore. Newcomers to Millbrook would eventually hear whispers about the nun who vanished, the mystery that had never been solved. Some claimed they had seen Margaret's ghost walking the forest path on September nights. Others insisted she had run away from religious life, though anyone who had known her dismissed this theory immediately. Detective Morrison, now a lieutenant, had never stopped thinking about the case. Approaching retirement, he often pulled out Margaret's file during quiet moments, studying the photographs and witness statements as if seeing them for the first time might reveal some overlooked clue. The case had become personal for him, a professional failure that gnawed at his sense of justice. The O'Connor family's grief had evolved into something deeper and more complex over the years. Thomas O'Connor, now in his 60s, had never married, dedicating his life to finding his sister. His Boston apartment was filled with maps, newspaper clippings, and correspondence with other families of missing persons. He had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, psychics, and amateur detectives, all searching for any trace of Margaret. Every few months, Thomas would drive down from Boston to walk the forest paths himself, calling Margaret's name into the silence. The local police knew him by sight now, this grieving brother who refused to let go. Some viewed him with pity, others with respect for his unwavering devotion. Sheriff Hayes, who had led the original search, had retired but still took Thomas's calls, listening patiently to new theories and reported sightings. The case had attracted its share of false leads over the years. A woman matching Margaret's description had been spotted at a bus station in Albany, but security footage proved it was someone else. A former convict claimed to know where she was buried, but his story fell apart under questioning. Each false hope was another wound for the O'Connor family, another reminder that justice remained elusive. In 1985, the state police had conducted a review of cold cases, and Margaret's disappearance was briefly reopened. New investigators interviewed witnesses again, applied updated forensic techniques to existing evidence, and expanded the search area. For a few months, hope flickered again in the hearts of her family and friends. But the review yielded nothing new, and the case was quietly shelved once more. The changing landscape of law enforcement in the 1980s meant that cases like Margaret's often got lost in bureaucratic shuffles. Computer databases were still primitive, communication between jurisdictions was limited, and DNA analysis was in its infancy. Missing persons cases, especially those involving adults who might have left voluntarily, received less priority than violent crimes with clear victims and suspects. Yet the forest kept its secrets. Hikers occasionally stumbled upon remnants of the original search, faded ribbons tied to trees to mark grid sections, rusty tent stakes from volunteer campsites. The logging road had been officially closed and was slowly being overgrown, but determined searchers could still access it. Every autumn, when the leaves fell and visibility improved, someone would organize an informal search party, usually led by Thomas O'Connor. The religious community had never forgotten Sister Margaret, even as the world moved on. Mother Superior Walsh maintained correspondence with other convents, sharing Margaret's photograph and asking sisters to pray for her safe return. The Catholic Church had procedures for dealing with missing religious, but they were designed for bureaucracy, not for the emotional reality of a community in perpetual mourning. Local teenagers sometimes dared each other to walk the old forest path at night, sharing ghost stories about the vanished nun. Their parents, many of whom remembered the original search, would scold them for their disrespect, but the stories persisted. Margaret O'Connor had become part of Millbrook's mythology, a reminder that even in quiet Connecticut towns, darkness could claim the innocent. By 1988, 9 years after that fateful September evening, it seemed that Sister Margaret's disappearance would remain an eternal mystery. The case file gathered dust. The family's hope was sustained only by stubborn faith, and the forest kept whatever secrets it held, locked away in its ancient silence. But forests, like truth, have a way of revealing their hidden treasures to those patient enough to wait and observant enough to see. The morning of October 12, 1988, dawned crisp and clear in the Connecticut woods. Two hikers, college students from nearby Wesleyan University, had decided to explore the abandoned logging roads that crisscrossed the forest behind Millbrook. Sarah Chen and Mike Rodriguez were amateur naturalists, documenting wildflowers and bird species for their biology class, armed with cameras and field notebooks. They had been walking for about an hour when Sarah's attention was caught by an enormous oak tree that had clearly stood sentinel in these woods for well over a century. Its massive trunk, easily 6 feet in diameter, was scarred by decades of storms and seasons. What drew her closer, however, were the exposed roots that created natural alcoves around the base of the ancient giant. "Mike, come look at this," Sarah called, kneeling beside one of the larger root formations. Something had caught the morning sunlight, something that definitely didn't belong in the forest floor's natural palette of browns and greys. Mike joined her, and together they carefully brushed away layers of fallen leaves and decomposed organic matter. What emerged from their gentle excavation would change everything the community of Millbrook thought it knew about Sister Margaret O'Connor's disappearance. It was a rosary, clearly very old, its wooden beads darkened by years of handling and weather exposure. But this wasn't just any rosary. The centerpiece medallion bore an intricate Celtic cross design, and attached to it was a small silver locket that had somehow survived 9 years in the elements with only minimal tarnishing. Sarah and Mike looked at each other with growing excitement and concern. They were both familiar with the local legend of the missing nun. Every college student in the area had heard the story. Could this be connected to Sister Margaret's disappearance? The rosary had obviously been here for years, partially buried by the natural accumulation of leaves and soil, protected by the massive root system that had embraced it like a natural shrine. The students carefully documented the exact location with their camera, taking photos from multiple angles before disturbing the scene further. Mike, a criminal justice minor, insisted they call the police before touching anything else. From a payphone at a nearby general store, they contacted the Millbrook Police Department. Lieutenant Frank Morrison received the call with the weary skepticism of someone who had fielded hundreds of false leads over the years. But something in the students' voices, their careful documentation, their detailed description of the rosary's distinctive features, made him pay attention. He agreed to meet them at the site within the hour. Standing beside that ancient oak tree, Morrison felt his pulse quicken for the first time in years regarding the O'Connor case. The rosary was unmistakably old and had clearly been buried there for an extended period. The Celtic cross design was distinctive, and the small silver locket suggested this was a family heirloom rather than a mass-produced religious item. Morrison carefully bagged the evidence, following procedures he had refined over 2 decades of police work. The location was photographed extensively, and the exact GPS coordinates were recorded. The rosary's position among the roots suggested it hadn't simply been dropped. It appeared to have been deliberately placed there, then covered by years of natural accumulation. Back at the station, Morrison placed an urgent call to Thomas O'Connor in Boston. The conversation began with the familiar wariness of a man who had received countless false hopes over 9 years. But Thomas's voice changed completely when Morrison described the Celtic cross design and the silver locket. "That's grandmother's rosary," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the phone. "Margaret inherited it when she took her vows. It belonged to our grandmother, Catherine O'Connor, who brought it from County Cork in 1892. The locket contains a tiny photograph of our grandfather and a piece of pressed shamrock from Ireland." Within hours, Thomas was driving down from Boston, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. 9 years of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, and now finally a tangible connection to his missing sister. The reunion between Thomas and his grandmother's rosary was heartbreaking to witness. As soon as Morrison showed him the evidence bag, Thomas broke down completely. "She never went anywhere without it," he sobbed. "Never. Margaret would have died before letting go of grandmother's rosary." The discovery changed everything about the investigation's timeline and theories. If Margaret had been carrying the rosary when she disappeared, and Thomas was adamant that she would have been, then its location nearly a mile from her usual prayer path suggested she had traveled much further into the forest than anyone had previously believed. More troubling, the deliberate placement among the oak tree's roots suggested human intervention. Mother Superior Walsh, now frail and in her 70s, was brought to identify the rosary. Her reaction was immediate and definitive. "This is Margaret's," she confirmed, her voice steady despite her tears. "I remember the day she received it from her family when she took her final vows. She treasured it above all her earthly possessions." The news of the discovery spread through Millbrook like wildfire. After 9 years of silence, there was finally something concrete, something real, that proved Sister Margaret had indeed walked these woods on that September evening in 1979. The local media picked up the story, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Margaret O'Connor's name appeared in newspaper headlines again. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had the rosary ended up nearly a mile from Margaret's usual path? Why had it been found in such an unusual location, nestled among the roots of the ancient oak, as if it had been deliberately placed there? And most importantly, where was Sister Margaret herself? Detective Morrison organized the most extensive search of the area since 1979. The discovery site became the center of expanding grid searches, with volunteers and professionals combing every inch of surrounding forest. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan beneath the oak tree and surrounding area. Cadaver dogs were deployed to search for any trace of human remains. For 3 weeks, the forest buzzed with activity. Volunteers came from as far away as Boston and New York, drawn by the renewed hope that Sister Margaret might finally be found. The O'Connor family established a temporary command post, coordinating with police and managing the media attention that had returned with renewed intensity. But despite the exhaustive search, no further evidence was found. The forest yielded no other secrets, no additional clues about what had happened to Sister Margaret O'Connor on that September evening 9 years earlier. The rosary remained the only tangible link to her disappearance, a single thread in a mystery that seemed determined to keep its secrets. As the search teams packed up their equipment and the media attention faded once again, one fact remained clear. Someone had placed that rosary among the oak tree's roots. Whether it was Margaret herself or someone else, the deliberate positioning suggested human intent, human knowledge, human secrets buried as deep as the rosary itself. The ancient oak had kept its treasure hidden for 9 years. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple. What other secrets might be waiting to be discovered? The discovery of Sister Margaret's rosary had awakened something in Lieutenant Frank Morrison that he thought had died years ago. Hope. For the first time since 1979, he had a concrete piece of evidence that could potentially lead somewhere new. But as weeks turned to months, that hope began to transform into something darker and more complex. Morrison found himself returning to the ancient oak tree repeatedly, sometimes alone, sometimes with other investigators. There was something about the location that bothered him, something beyond the obvious significance of finding Margaret's most treasured possession there. The tree stood in a part of the forest that was notably isolated, accessible by foot, but well off any established hiking trails or logging roads. The more Morrison studied the terrain, the more convinced he became that whoever had placed the rosary there knew the forest intimately. This wasn't a random location chosen by a panicked criminal trying to dispose of evidence. The ancient oak was a landmark, a natural monument that someone familiar with these woods would remember and be able to find again. During his investigation, Morrison had compiled detailed profiles of everyone who might have had regular access to the forest in 1979. The list included local hunters, hikers, utility workers, and a handful of residents whose properties bordered the wooded area. Most had been interviewed during the original investigation, but Morrison decided to approach them again with fresh eyes and new questions. One name that kept appearing in various contexts was Daniel Hartwell, a local handyman who had done occasional work at St. Catherine's Convent over the years. Hartwell, now in his 50s, had been 37 at the time of Margaret's disappearance. He was known throughout Millbrook as a reliable worker who could fix anything from leaky pipes to broken fence posts. What made Hartwell particularly interesting to Morrison was his intimate knowledge of the local forest. As a young man, he had worked for the State Forestry Service, maintaining trails and conducting wildlife surveys. His job had required him to traverse every section of the woodland, including the remote areas where few others ever ventured. If anyone knew about the ancient oak tree, it would be Daniel Hartwell. Morrison's first re-interview with Hartwell took place at the man's small workshop behind his house on Maple Street. Hartwell seemed genuinely cooperative, expressing sympathy for the O'Connor family and offering to help however he could. But there was something in his manner, a nervous energy, a tendency to provide more information than Morrison had asked for, that triggered the detective's instincts. "I remember Sister Margaret," Hartwell said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Sweet lady, always polite when I was working up at the convent. Such a shame what happened to her." When Morrison asked about Hartwell's knowledge of the forest, the handyman's expertise became immediately apparent. He could describe specific locations with remarkable detail, including areas that weren't marked on any official maps. He mentioned the ancient oak tree before Morrison brought it up, describing it as a landmark that everyone who really knows these woods would recognize. Over several interviews, Morrison began to notice inconsistencies in Hartwell's recollections of September 15, 1979. Initially, Hartwell claimed he had been home all evening, watching television. But when pressed for details, his story became vague and shifting. He couldn't remember what programs he had watched, or provide any witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts. The breakthrough came when Morrison decided to examine old work records from the convent. Mother Superior Walsh had kept meticulous financial records, including receipts for all maintenance and repair work. The records showed that Daniel Hartwell had been scheduled to repair a section of fence along the convent's eastern boundary, the same boundary that bordered the forest path Margaret walked every evening. More significantly, the work order was dated September 14, 1979, the day before Margaret's disappearance. According to the convent's records, Hartwell had completed the fence repair that afternoon and would have had intimate knowledge of Margaret's daily routine, having observed her evening walks while working in the area. When confronted with this information, Hartwell's demeanor changed dramatically. The cooperative handyman became defensive and evasive, claiming he couldn't remember specific details from so many years ago. But Morrison pressed harder, pointing out that Hartwell had provided very specific details about other aspects of that time period. The investigation took on new urgency. Morrison obtained search warrants for Hartwell's property and vehicles. While no physical evidence directly linking him to Margaret's disappearance was found, investigators discovered something troubling: a collection of photographs and newspaper clippings about Margaret's case, far more extensive than a casual observer might collect. Hidden in Hartwell's workshop, tucked behind other papers, investigators found detailed maps of the forest with various locations marked in pencil. The ancient oak tree was circled heavily, with notations in Hartwell's handwriting about natural markers and memory locations. Psychological profiling suggested that Hartwell fit the pattern of someone who might have become obsessed with a victim before attacking. His legitimate access to the convent grounds, combined with his extensive knowledge of the forest and Margaret's routine, presented a compelling circumstantial case. But circumstantial evidence wasn't enough for charges, especially 9 years after the fact. Morrison needed something more concrete, something that would definitively link Hartwell to Margaret's disappearance. The Rosary, while significant, didn't provide direct evidence of Hartwell's involvement. The pressure began to take its toll on Hartwell. Neighbors reported seeing him walking through town at odd hours, muttering to himself. His work quality deteriorated, and several longtime customers stopped hiring him. The weight of suspicion, even without formal charges, was destroying the life he had built in Millbrook. Thomas O'Connor, meanwhile, was experiencing his own psychological turmoil. After 9 years of desperate searching, he finally had a suspect, someone on whom he could focus his grief and anger. But Morrison cautioned him against taking matters into his own hands, reminding him that they needed solid evidence to ensure justice was properly served. The case had reached a critical juncture. Morrison believed he knew who was responsible for Margaret's disappearance, but proving it would require either a confession or the discovery of additional evidence. The ancient oak had revealed one secret: the location of Margaret's cherished rosary. The question was whether it, or the forest itself, held other secrets that could finally bring Sister Margaret O'Connor home. The autumn of 1989 brought an unseasonable warmth to Millbrook, as if nature itself was reluctant to let another year pass without resolution. Lieutenant Morrison had spent months building a case against Daniel Hartwell, but every lead seemed to stop just short of the evidence needed for an arrest warrant. The circumstantial case was strong, but Connecticut's district attorney had made it clear that circumstantial evidence alone wouldn't be enough to prosecute a 10-year-old murder case. Hartwell's behavior had become increasingly erratic as the investigation focused on him. Longtime neighbors reported that he had started drinking heavily, often seen stumbling home from Millbrook's only tavern well after midnight. His handyman business had all but collapsed as word spread through the small community that he was a suspect in Sister Margaret's disappearance. The psychological pressure was having an effect that Morrison had seen before in guilty suspects. Hartwell began making mistakes, contradicting himself in casual conversations, offering explanations for things no one had accused him of. It was as if the weight of his secret was becoming unbearable, pushing him toward the edge of confession. Thomas O'Connor had relocated temporarily to Millbrook, taking a room at the town's small inn so he could be closer to the investigation. His presence was both a blessing and a complication for Morrison. Thomas's determination kept the case in the public eye, but his obvious grief and anger made Hartwell increasingly paranoid and defensive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Father Michael Brennan, the elderly priest who served both St. Catherine's Convent and Millbrook's Catholic Church, approached Morrison with information that would change everything. "I need to speak with you about Daniel Hartwell," Father Brennan said, his face grave with the weight of moral conflict. "What I'm about to tell you comes very close to violating the sanctity of confession, but I believe Sister Margaret's soul, and Mr. Hartwell's, require me to speak." Morrison listened as Father Brennan described a conversation he had had with Hartwell 3 weeks earlier. Hartwell had come to confession in an agitated state, but instead of confessing sins, he had rambled about guilt, about carrying burdens, about how some secrets eat you alive from the inside. He didn't confess to anything specific, Father Brennan explained carefully, but he kept saying that he knew where she was, that he had always known, and that knowing was destroying him. He asked me repeatedly whether God could forgive someone who let a family suffer for years when they could end that suffering with just a few words. While Father Brennan's information couldn't be used directly in court due to priest-penitent privilege, it gave Morrison the insight he needed to plan his next approach. Hartwell was clearly struggling with guilt, possibly ready to confess if approached correctly. Morrison decided on a strategy that was risky, but had worked before with guilt-ridden suspects. Instead of another formal interrogation, he would arrange for a seemingly casual encounter where Hartwell might feel safe enough to unburden himself. The opportunity came when Morrison learned that Hartwell had been spending his evenings at the ancient oak tree where Margaret's rosary had been found. According to hikers who had spotted him, Hartwell would sit against the massive trunk for hours, sometimes talking to himself, sometimes just staring into the forest depths. On October 28, 1989, almost exactly 1 year after the rosary's discovery, Morrison made his way to the ancient oak just before sunset. As expected, He found Hartwell sitting with his back against the tree, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. "Mind if I join you?" Morrison asked, keeping his tone conversational rather than confrontational. Hartwell looked up with red-rimmed eyes, but didn't object as Morrison settled against the opposite side of the massive trunk. For several minutes, they sat in silence as darkness gathered in the forest around them. "She trusted me," Hartwell finally said, his voice barely audible. "That was the worst part. She actually smiled and said hello when she saw me that night. No fear at all." Morrison's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm and silent, letting Hartwell continue at his own pace. "I didn't plan it," Hartwell went on, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I was just walking, trying to clear my head after things went bad with Linda. My wife had left me that morning, took the kids. I was angry, confused, I wasn't thinking straight." The confession poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Hartwell described encountering Sister Margaret on her evening walk, engaging her in conversation about the fence repair he had completed. In his distraught emotional state, he had misinterpreted her kindness as something more personal, something that could ease his pain and loneliness. When she tried to leave to continue her walk, I grabbed her arm, just to keep talking, you know, but she was frightened then. She started to call out, and I panicked. I put my hand over her mouth to quiet her, and she struggled, and then— Hartwell's voice broke completely. "It happened so fast. She fell and hit her head on a rock. There was blood, and she wasn't moving, and I knew she was gone." Morrison carefully extracted the full story. In his panic, Hartwell had carried Margaret's body deeper into the forest, to a location he knew well from his forestry work, a natural depression hidden by dense undergrowth where old-timers had once dumped farm waste. He had buried her there, using tools from his truck to dig a grave that he camouflaged carefully. But he couldn't bring himself to bury the Rosary with her body. "It was too beautiful," he sobbed. "Too holy. I couldn't put something so sacred in the ground with what I had done. So I kept it for a while, and then I buried it by the oak tree. I thought maybe someday someone would find it and know she had been here, know that she mattered. Se este caso já te prendeu, deixa o like. Isso ajuda o canal a trazer mais histórias como essa, e a história da Margaret O'Connor a alcançar mais pessoas." Morrison carefully guided Hartwell through the details of the location where Margaret's remains could be found. With GPS coordinates and Hartwell's detailed knowledge of the forest, recovery teams would be able to locate the burial site that had remained hidden for over 10 years. As dawn broke over the Connecticut forest, Daniel Hartwell was formally arrested for the murder of Sister Margaret O'Connor. The ancient oak tree, which had kept Margaret's rosary safe for 9 years, had finally witnessed the confession that would bring her story full circle. The weight of silence had finally become unbearable, and the truth had emerged from the depths of guilt and forest shadows, where it had been buried for a decade. The morning of October 29, 1989, brought a convergence of law enforcement, forensic specialists, and grieving family members to a remote section of Connecticut forest that had kept its secret for over 10 years. Daniel Hartwell, now in custody and formally charged, had provided detailed directions to the location where he claimed to have buried Sister Margaret O'Connor's remains. Lieutenant Morrison coordinated the recovery operation with the State Police Forensics Team and the County Coroner's Office. Thomas O'Connor had insisted on being present, despite Morrison's gentle suggestions that he might want to wait for confirmation before facing what they might find. But Thomas was adamant. He had searched for his sister for over a decade, and he would see this through to the end. Mother Superior Catherine Walsh, now in her late 70s and physically frail, had also requested to be present. She arrived at the forest site accompanied by Sister Agnes and the convent's chaplain, Father Brennan. The elderly nun's presence lent a solemn dignity to the proceedings that somehow felt appropriate for the recovery of one of their own. The location Hartwell had described was approximately 2 miles from Sister Margaret's usual prayer path, in a natural depression surrounded by dense undergrowth and fallen logs. It was the kind of place that could remain undisturbed for decades, hidden from casual hikers and hunters by the thick vegetation that had grown up around it over the years. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the forensic anthropologist leading the recovery team, approached the excavation with the methodical precision required for such sensitive work. Every layer of soil was carefully removed and sifted, every fragment photographed and documented. The process was painstakingly slow, but necessary to preserve any evidence that might still exist after 10 years in the ground. As the excavation progressed, the emotional weight of the moment became almost unbearable for those watching. Thomas O'Connor stood silent and pale, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. Mother Superior Walsh prayed quietly, her rosary beads moving through her fingers in a rhythm that had comforted her through decades of joys and sorrows. The first indication that Hartwell's confession was accurate came when Dr. Martinez's team uncovered fragments of grey fabric, the same color as the habits worn by the sisters of St. Catherine's Convent. The fabric was remarkably well preserved, protected by the acidic soil conditions and the natural tannins from decades of fallen leaves. As more of the burial site was carefully excavated, the full scope of the tragedy began to emerge. Sister Margaret's remains were found in a position that suggested Hartwell's account was truthful. She appeared to have been placed in the ground with some care, rather than simply dumped. Even in his panic and guilt, some part of Daniel Hartwell had retained enough humanity to treat her body with a measure of respect. Dr. Martinez worked with painstaking care to document every detail of the recovery. The positioning of the remains, the condition of the fabric, the soil composition, every element would be crucial for the legal proceedings that would follow. But beyond the forensic requirements, there was a deeper recognition that this was someone's beloved sister, someone's cherished friend, finally coming home after years of uncertainty. The discovery of Sister Margaret's religious medals, still around what remained of her neck, provided the final confirmation of identity. The small silver cross and St. Christopher medal had been given to her by the convent when she took her final vows. Thomas O'Connor recognized them immediately, his composure finally breaking as he saw these tangible connections to his sister's faith and calling. The cause of death was consistent with Hartwell's confession. Dr. Martinez found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull that would have been fatal. The injury pattern suggested an accidental impact with a hard, rough surface, exactly what Hartwell had described when he said Margaret had fallen and struck her head on a rock during their struggle. For Thomas O'Connor, the mixture of relief and renewed grief was almost overwhelming. After 10 years of not knowing, of imagining endless possibilities both hopeful and horrific, there was finally certainty. His sister was dead, had been dead all along, but at least now he knew what had happened to her. The nightmare of uncertainty was over, replaced by the different but somehow more manageable pain of definitive loss. Mother Superior Walsh approached the recovery site as Dr. Martinez and her team carefully prepared Sister Margaret's remains for transport. The elderly nun had presided over many funerals in her decades of religious service, but this felt different, more personal, more tragic. Margaret had been her friend and colleague, someone whose absence had left a hole in the convent community that had never been filled. "She's finally coming home," Mother Superior Walsh whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. After all these years, Margaret is finally coming home. The local media had gotten word of the recovery operation, and by afternoon, news crews from Hartford and New Haven had arrived at the forest site. But Morrison had established a perimeter that kept them at a respectful distance. This was a moment for family and faith community, not for public spectacle. As the sun began to set on that October day, Sister Margaret O'Connor's remains were transported from the forest that had been her accidental grave for over 10 years. The ancient oak tree that had safeguarded her rosary stood silent witness to this final chapter of her earthly story, its massive presence somehow appropriate for the magnitude of what had transpired. Father Brennan conducted a brief prayer service at the recovery site before the forensic team completed their work. The prayers were for Margaret's soul, for her family's healing, and even for Daniel Hartwell, whose moment of violence had created so much suffering for so many people. The priest's words carried across the forest, a benediction for a woman whose life of service had ended in tragedy, but whose memory had inspired years of unwavering love and determination. The recovery was complete, but the work of healing, for Thomas, for the convent community, for the town of Millbrook, was just beginning. Sister Margaret O'Connor had finally been found, but the impact of her loss would continue to ripple through the lives of all who had loved her and searched for her. In death, as in life, she had brought people together in faith, hope, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The trial of Daniel Hartwell for the murder of Sister Margaret O'Connor began on a cold February morning in 1990. more than 10 years after that fateful September evening when a simple evening walk had ended in tragedy. The Hartford County Courthouse was packed with observers, family members, members of the religious community, residents of Millbrook, and media representatives from across New England. District Attorney Robert Chen had decided to charge Hartwell with second-degree murder rather than first-degree, acknowledging that the evidence supported Hartwell's claim that Margaret's death had not been premeditated. But the charge was still serious enough to carry a potential sentence of 25 years to life, reflecting the severity of what had occurred in those Connecticut woods. Thomas O'Connor sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Beside him sat Mother Superior Catherine Walsh, now using a walker, but determined to see justice done for her departed sister in faith. The presence of the religious community lent a solemn dignity to the proceedings that everyone in the courtroom could feel. Hartwell's defense attorney, public defender Maria Santos, faced a nearly impossible task. Her client had confessed, led police to the body, and provided details that only the perpetrator could know. But Santos was determined to present mitigating circumstances that might reduce the severity of the sentence, if not the conviction itself. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Lieutenant Morrison testified about the years-long investigation, the discovery of the Rosary, and finally, Hartwell's confession at the ancient oak tree. Dr. Sarah Martinez presented the forensic evidence that corroborated Hartwell's account of how Sister Margaret had died. But the most powerful testimony came from those who had known Margaret in life. Thomas O'Connor took the witness stand to describe his sister's character, her devotion to her faith, and the devastating impact of her disappearance on their family. His voice remained steady as he recounted the years of searching, of false hopes and crushing disappointments, of never giving up because love demanded that he continue looking for her. "My sister Margaret chose a life of service," Thomas testified. "She believed in the goodness of people, in helping others, in making the world a little bit better through her prayers and her work. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does." Mother Superior Walsh's testimony was equally compelling. Despite her advanced age and failing health, her voice rang clear as she described Margaret's role in the convent community, her daily routines, and the hole her absence had left in their lives. "Sister Margaret was scheduled to help with our children's reading program the week after she disappeared," Mother Superior Walsh testified. "For 10 years, I've wondered what those children missed by not having her guidance. She had so much left to give." The defense attempted to portray Hartwell as a man who had suffered his own tragedies, the breakdown of his marriage, his struggles with alcohol, his inability to cope with personal crisis. Santos argued that Margaret's death had been genuinely accidental, the result of a moment of poor judgment, rather than criminal intent. Hartwell himself took the witness stand, a decision that surprised many court observers. Through tears and obvious emotional anguish, he recounted the events of September 15, 1979, providing details that painted him as a man overwhelmed by personal crisis who had made a series of catastrophic decisions. "I never meant to hurt her," Hartwell testified, his voice barely audible. "Sister Margaret was a good person, a holy person. When I saw her on that path, I needed someone to talk to. I was falling apart and she was so kind, so willing to listen. But then I misunderstood, and when she tried to leave..." His testimony became increasingly difficult to follow as emotion overwhelmed him. He described the accident, his panic, his terrible decision to hide what had happened rather than immediately calling for help. "I know I should have called the police right away," he sobbed. "Maybe she could have been saved if I had, but I was scared, and I made everything worse. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 10 years. The prosecution's cross-examination was relentless, but professional. District Attorney Chen systematically dismantled Hartwell's claims of accidental death, pointing out that his decision to move and bury Margaret's body demonstrated consciousness of guilt and criminal intent. "You had multiple opportunities to do the right thing," Chen pressed. "You could have called for an ambulance, you could have reported the accident to police. Instead, you chose to bury Sister Margaret in the forest and let her family suffer for 10 years, not knowing what happened to her." The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, and Hartwell's own confession had sealed his fate. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of second-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, The court heard victim impact statements from Thomas O'Connor and other family members, from the convent community, and from residents of Millbrook who had been affected by Margaret's disappearance. The collective weight of their testimony painted a picture of a life cut short and a community forever changed by senseless violence. Thomas O'Connor's statement was particularly powerful. Standing just feet from the man who had killed his sister, he spoke with remarkable composure about forgiveness and justice. "I don't hate you, Mr. Hartwell," Thomas said, looking directly at the defendant. "Margaret taught me that hatred only destroys the person who carries it, but justice requires that you face the consequences of your actions. My sister can't speak for herself anymore, so I speak for her when I say that what you did was wrong, and you must be held accountable." Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Daniel Hartwell to 20 years in prison, citing both the seriousness of the crime and the mitigating circumstances of Margaret's accidental death. It was a sentence that satisfied few completely, but reflected the complex nature of the case. As Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, he turned back toward Thomas O'Connor and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Thomas nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke to the grace that his sister had exemplified in life and that somehow lived on in those who had loved her. The trial was over, but for the O'Connor family and the community of Millbrook, the work of healing was just beginning. Justice had been served, but the pain of loss remained. Sister Margaret O'Connor could finally rest in peace, but her absence would be felt forever by those whose lives she had touched. The years following Daniel Hartwell's conviction brought a strange mixture of closure and continuing grief to all those whose lives had been touched by Sister Margaret O'Connor's tragedy. Justice had been served, but the ripple effects of that September evening in 1979 continued to spread through the community like stones thrown into still water. Thomas O'Connor, now in his 60s, had finally been able to lay his sister to rest. The funeral at St. Catherine's Convent in November 1990 had drawn hundreds of mourners from across New England. Religious communities that had prayed for Margaret's safe return for over a decade came to pay their final respects to a woman whose disappearance had touched the hearts of believers everywhere. Margaret was buried in the convent's small cemetery, her grave marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Sister Margaret O'Connor, 1917-1979, faithful servant of God." But Thomas had insisted on adding a personal inscription, "Beloved sister, your light continues to shine." The years that followed were a period of gradual healing for Thomas. He had spent more than a decade consumed by the search for his missing sister, putting his own life on hold while pursuing every lead and clue. Now, finally able to grieve properly, he began the slow process of rebuilding a life that had been suspended in time since 1979. Thomas never married, dedicating himself instead to victims' rights advocacy. He became a spokesperson for families of missing persons, using his experience to help others navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of having a loved one disappear. His work with various organizations helped change laws and policies regarding missing person investigations, ensuring that future cases would receive more thorough and sustained attention. Mother Superior Catherine Walsh lived only 2 more years after Margaret's funeral, passing away peacefully in 1992 at the age of 84. Those who knew her said she had never fully recovered from the shock of Margaret's disappearance and the revelation of her violent death. But in her final years she had found some peace knowing that Margaret had finally come home. The convent itself underwent significant changes in the 1990s. The Catholic Church's declining number of religious vocations meant fewer sisters available to maintain the community. St. Catherine's eventually merged with a larger convent in Hartford, and the beautiful old buildings in Millbrook were converted into a retreat center for lay people seeking spiritual renewal. The forest where Margaret had died became an unexpected pilgrimage site for some. The ancient oak tree where her rosary had been found was marked with a small plaque placed by the O'Connor family. Visitors would sometimes leave flowers or prayer cards, and Thomas made an annual pilgrimage there on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. Daniel Hartwell served 18 years of his 20-year sentence before being released on parole in 2008. His time in prison had been marked by participation in various rehabilitation programs and genuine efforts to understand and atone for his actions. Prison records showed that he had become deeply religious during his incarceration, finding in faith some measure of peace with what he had done. Upon his release, Hartwell left Connecticut entirely, moving to a small town in Maine where he worked quietly as a maintenance worker for a local school district. He had written several letters to Thomas O'Connor over the years, seeking forgiveness and expressing remorse, but Thomas had chosen not to respond. Some wounds, Thomas believed, were beyond the healing power of words. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who had dedicated so much of his career to solving Margaret's case, retired from the police force in 1995. The successful resolution of the O'Connor investigation had been the highlight of his law enforcement career, but it had also shown him the importance of never giving up on cases that others might consider hopeless. Morrison established a cold case consulting firm, working with police departments across New England to review unsolved disappearances and murders. His experience with Margaret's case had taught him that persistence, attention to detail, and sometimes a bit of luck could bring resolution even to cases that seemed impossibly stale. The impact of Margaret's story extended far beyond the immediate participants in the tragedy. Her case became a teaching tool in law enforcement academies, illustrating the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining case files, and never completely closing investigations into unsolved disappearances. The discovery of her rosary 9 years after her death demonstrated that evidence could surface at any time, potentially breaking open cold cases. The religious community also drew lessons from Margaret's story. Convents and monasteries across the country reviewed their security procedures and implemented new protocols for religious who walked or worked alone in isolated areas. Margaret's death had shown that even those devoted to God's service were not immune to human violence. For the town of Millbrook, Margaret's case became part of the community's collective memory. New residents would eventually learn about the nun who had disappeared and the decade-long mystery that had consumed the town's attention. The story served as a reminder that evil could touch even the most peaceful communities, but also that persistence and faith could ultimately triumph over darkness. In 2004, 25 years after Margaret's disappearance, Thomas O'Connor established the Sister Margaret O'Connor Foundation for Missing Persons. The organization provided support and resources for families dealing with missing loved ones, offered rewards for information in cold cases, and advocated for improved law enforcement procedures in missing person investigations. The Foundation's motto, taken from one of Margaret's favorite Bible verses, was simple but powerful: "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Thomas often spoke at the Foundation's annual fundraising dinner, telling Margaret's story to new audiences and emphasizing that her death, while tragic, had led to positive changes that might prevent other families from suffering as his had. It was, he said, Margaret's final gift to the world, the transformation of tragedy into hope. As the years passed, the acute pain of Margaret's loss softened into a gentler but permanent sadness. Thomas had learned to carry his grief without being crushed by it, to honor his sister's memory while building a meaningful life of his own. The search for Margaret had defined him for over a decade, but her legacy would define him for the rest of his life. The autumn of 2004 marked 25 years since Sister Margaret O'Connor's disappearance, and Thomas O'Connor, now 71 years old, made his annual pilgrimage to the ancient oak tree in the Connecticut forest. The small plaque he had placed there years earlier had weathered beautifully, its bronze surface developing a patina that seemed to blend naturally with the bark of the massive tree. As Thomas knelt beside the oak's enormous roots, placing fresh white roses where Margaret's rosary had been discovered, he reflected on how much had changed since that terrible September evening in 1979. The world had moved on. Technology had advanced dramatically, and new generations had grown up never knowing the gentle nun whose disappearance had once captivated an entire region. But some things remained constant. The ancient oak still stood sentinel in the forest, its massive presence offering the same sense of permanence and peace that had drawn Margaret to these woods for her evening prayers. The silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds, a natural cathedral that seemed fitting for remembering a woman of faith. Thomas had brought with him a leather journal, one of many he had filled over the years with memories of Margaret, thoughts about their family, and reflections on the long journey from loss to healing. Opening to a fresh page, he began to write. 25 years ago today, the world lost Margaret O'Connor, but in losing her, so many people found something else: the strength to persevere, the courage to seek truth, the faith to believe that light ultimately conquers darkness. The Sister Margaret O'Connor Foundation had grown beyond Thomas's wildest expectations. What had started as a small organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons had evolved into a significant force in victims' rights advocacy. The foundation had assisted in solving dozens of cold cases, provided support to hundreds of families, and lobbied successfully for legislative changes that improved how law enforcement handled missing person investigations. Each success was, in Thomas's mind, a small victory for Margaret's memory. Every missing person found, every family reunited, every cold case solved, carried forward the legacy of his sister's life and the tragedy of her death. Margaret had devoted her life to serving others. Now, even in death, she continued to serve through the work done in her name. The Foundation's annual conference had become a gathering place for families of missing persons, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates from across the country. The conference always began with Thomas telling Margaret's story, not just the tragedy of her death, but the triumph of persistence that had ultimately brought her home. Margaret's case teaches us that time doesn't heal all wounds, Thomas would tell the assembled crowd. But time can transform wounds into wisdom, pain into purpose, and loss into legacy. We cannot bring back our loved ones, but we can ensure that their stories continue to matter, continue to make a difference. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, now in his 70s and still consulting on cold cases, had become a close friend of Thomas over the years. Morrison often spoke at the Foundation's events, sharing the investigative techniques that had finally cracked Margaret's case and emphasizing the importance of never giving up on seemingly hopeless investigations. Sister Margaret's Rosary lay buried in that forest for 9 years before hikers discovered it. Morrison would remind his audiences of law enforcement officials. Evidence can surface at any time. Witnesses can develop new insights. Technology advances can make previously unusable evidence suddenly valuable. The moment we close our minds to the possibility of solving a case is the moment we fail the victims and their families. The forest itself had become a place of pilgrimage for many, beyond just the O'Connor family. Other families who had lost loved ones to violence would sometimes visit the ancient oak, finding comfort in the story of how persistence and faith had ultimately triumphed over mystery and despair. A small memorial garden had been established near the tree, maintained by volunteers from various religious communities who saw in Margaret's story a reflection of their own faith and values. Daniel Hartwell had been out of prison for several years by 2004, living quietly in his small Maine town and working to rebuild some semblance of a meaningful life. He had never attempted to contact Thomas directly after his release, respecting the family's need for distance and peace. But those who knew Hartwell said he carried the weight of his crime every day, attending daily mass and volunteering with homeless shelters and food banks in what seemed like a perpetual effort to atone for what he had done. On this 25th anniversary, Thomas had received an unexpected letter forwarded through the Foundation's offices. The return address showed it was from Hartwell, and after much consideration, Thomas had decided to read it during his visit to the oak tree. The letter was brief but deeply heartfelt. Mr. O'Connor, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this. 25 years have passed since I destroyed your sister's life and changed yours forever. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Sister Margaret, about the person she was and the good she was doing in the world. I know my apologies can never bring her back or undo the pain I caused, but I want you to know that her memory has changed me. I've tried to live the rest of my life in a way that might honor what she stood for: service to others, compassion for the suffering, faith in redemption. I pray for her soul and for your peace every day. Daniel Hartwell. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his journal. He had long ago forgiven Hartwell, not because the man deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hatred would have dishonored Margaret's memory and poisoned his own heart. Margaret had lived her life believing in the possibility of redemption for all people. Thomas tried to honor that belief, even when it was difficult. As the sun began to set through the forest canopy, Thomas rose from his knees beside the ancient oak. His pilgrimage was complete for another year, but his work continued. Tomorrow he would return to the Foundation offices, where new cases waited for attention and new families needed support in their darkest hours. The mystery of Sister Margaret O'Connor's disappearance had been solved decades ago, but her story continued to inspire and guide those who encountered it. In a world where violence often seemed senseless and justice elusive, Margaret's case proved that persistence could overcome the longest odds, that love could survive the deepest grief, and that even in the darkest forests, truth eventually found a way to emerge into the light. Walking back through the Connecticut woods as twilight gathered, Thomas could almost hear his sister's voice in the rustling leaves overhead, reminding him that some vigils never end, some loves never fade, and some lights shine forever in the darkness. The ancient oak stood guard over its secrets no longer, but it remained a sentinel for memory, for faith, and for the eternal hope that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Epilogue. Sister Margaret O'Connor's Rosary now rests in a place of honor in the chapel at the Hartford Retreat Center that was once St. Catherine's Convent. Visitors often pause before the small display case to read her story and offer prayers for missing persons everywhere. The Rosary serves as both a memorial to Margaret's life and a symbol of hope for families still searching for their loved ones. Thomas O'Connor passed away peacefully in 2019 at the age of 86, having spent the final decades of his life transforming personal tragedy into public service. The Sister Margaret O'Connor Foundation continues its work under new leadership, guided by the principles Thomas established and the memory of a nun whose evening walk became an eternal journey toward justice and truth. In the Connecticut forest, the ancient oak still stands, its massive trunk scarred by storms but unbroken by time. Seasons change, years pass, but the tree remains, a living monument to persistence, faith, and the enduring power of love to triumph over the darkest mysteries of the human heart. Margaret's light continues to shine. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of David and Ryan Collins. We'll see you in the next video.